Welcome to the MBA Series. This is a special multi-part series within Next Economy Now. We are going to review the arc of the learning journey that is presented in the Next Economy MBA online course. We are open sourcing the content from our course and hope to share it in this shorter, bite-sized format. We are launching this series because we were asked to do it by listeners like you. We're also doing it because we are writing a book entitled The Next Economy MBA, Redesigning Business for the Benefit of All Life, which will be published on May 23rd, 2023 by Barrett Kohler Publishers. This is a sizable series. There will eventually be 18 podcast episodes of course content and 9 interviews with MBA alumni. We will be rotating every other week with our normal Next Economy Now interview format. We hope you enjoy it. Please reach out to us via our website, lifteconomy.com, with any comments, feedback, or requests. And now, on with the show.
Welcome to the MBA Series. This is episode 12, Culture 1, Values and Team. My name is Kevin Bayuk. I'm a worker owner at Lift Economy, and I'm here with Phoenix Soleil, also a worker owner at Lift Economy. Thanks, Phoenix, for being here.
I'm glad to be here.
And when we say Culture 1, Values and Team, those of you who have been listening to the series know that we've covered some of the principles that we think are important from our own observations about how organizations are designing and operating to manage to create this transition from the business as usual economy that tends towards exploitation of people and planet to the next economy that authentically works for the benefit of all life with nobody left out. And when they apply these principles, there's different ways for them to express and apply the principles in different aspects of organizing humans together to provide needed goods and services for their community. And now we're in kind of the nuts and bolts. So the last session we talked about vision and vision alignment. And this one we're talking about culture and values and the importance of team. And there's a number of principles that can be expressed in the way an organization designs around its culture and operates around its culture. But these terms are sometimes terms and words that business as usual says are like soft or unimportant or they're marginalized. So Phoenix, when I say culture and an organization in the next economy, what comes to mind for you? Why is culture something that we might want to pay attention to?
Well, yeah, it's a big question, like how to define culture, because it's kind of like the invisible, it's kind of like the water we swim in, but the more we know what the water is, the more we can be effective. Because one way to describe it is like I've worked at places, you walk in and you know that, oh, if you're not wearing a certain kind of dress, the formal, then you feel kind of out of place, right? And then other places I've worked in where if I wore something formal, I'd feel out of place. And then there's things like I've worked at places where it's kind of understood we're loose about time. As long as you get the work done, we don't care when you do it. That's kind of like, it might be what I think one of our arguments is the more that's articulated and known, self-aware of, the more we have agency with that. And in other places I've gone in, it's like time is really important. If you're more than 5 minutes late, that's not acceptable. And then there's different things about authenticity or humor. Some places, one of the things we appreciate about this place is that we tease each other. And that's kind of accepted and one of the things that supports us in feeling cohesive. Culture is so important because it's how we connect to the others. It's how we feel a sense of harmony. And one of the things we say is that, I guess I'm repeating myself, it's like when you know, for example, the things that work in your culture and the things that don't work, and you can start to articulate it and discuss it, then you can have more power, like if introducing new culture or making whatever works even stronger. It's also a way of being able to bring people to you, because you're like, hey, what we really appreciate authenticity here. So then you can say that to new employees. I mean, this is that you're going to get a certain type of person who is attracted to that kind of culture.
I think that's great. And that aligns well with a lot of the principles that we talked about in earlier sessions, like transparency. And it's kind of a prerequisite to develop a culture together and co-create it together, to have some type of democratic governance process in the organization. And so with those ideas, principles kind of being expressed in a culture, I think the thing that comes to my mind is that if anybody's ever worked in an organization where it's like, wow, this feels so easy, it's like flowing, and I can be meaningfully engaged, productive, and serving the community without having to worry about politics and internal dynamics and how much energy that can take away from people if they have to focus on those types of things. And a lot of the way we've organized this MBA series and the book is based kind of critical success factors where we see, of the hundreds of organizations we've had the privilege to work with who are trying to navigate this transition to the next economy, where do they break down? What are the failure points? And this inattention to culture, because business as usual typically marginalizes it, shows up as one of the key factors that can lead to an organization having too much internal friction and unraveling, despite wonderful intentions, beautiful humans working together on something that's very important, that they consider is important for their community, that their community considers important, and yet they break down. There's Sean Berry on our team would point out to me that without setting intentionally, transparently, and explicitly organizing the culture in some way, it will tend toward what he calls mediocrity, towards the middle. So there's this tension that if, for example, if it's unexamined and unarticulated and a couple people tend to show up late, some people show up early to a meeting, but maybe a few more people show up late, the meetings will start later. Just as a simple example. So everything will move towards the majority. And so that might be a very banal example, but this orientation towards an aspirational culture is something that we think is really important, meaning setting a North Star that, hey, when we work together, we want to actually create a culture where being part of this organization is actually an opportunity for personal growth and development. We spend, as the average American, it's some crazy statistic, like 80,000 hours of our lives in a vocational setting. For some people, this is almost as much time that they spend with their family or more. And so the opportunity is like, well, what if we oriented a culture that actually made us better humans, better for ourselves, for our family, for our community? And the cost of not investing in culture and organizing it, I mentioned it a moment ago, is like actually could lead to failure. But what we definitely see is like time, resolving conflict, implicit power structures that show up, and especially domination culture features that show up in an organization create marginalization, and then the performance of the organization to actually serve the community drops, and then ultimately it could be turnover and people leaving the organization. These are kind of things that happen. So those are all reasons why we, in our work at Lift Economy and in the book, we feature, even in the MBA, we have 2 full sessions on culture. This one being on values and team, the next one really focusing on communication. I brought up the word values. Do you want to add to that?
No, yeah, I just want to say, for example, one of the things we know about successful culture, especially if you care about being innovative, creative, problem solving, one of the things we know is diversity supports that. Having people from different perspectives seeing things is one of the things that helps with creative ideas. And that's been seen in lots of studies by Scientific America, Google and their work they've done, and then Harvard Business Review have talked about this. But then what happens is that sometimes the default culture of business as usual is to not express divergent point of views. Emotional safety, for example, is one of the things that makes it possible for people to argue, to challenge each other, which is uncomfortable, but then that's what allows for creative going outside the box. So if you are a company that wants to be innovative, you have to be paying attention to culture, and you have to be very conscious about changing it, making sure it's not going towards the mediocre, that people feel safe. And that's, usually not something that people have a lot of skills around coming into the workplace. So it does, but there's a lot of business benefit. And of course, a lot of times people who are interested in doing social enterprise, they're in it not just for the profit, but they're also in it to create, like you said, a workplace that has qualitative improvement where people feel fulfilled. So there's lots of good reasons to pay attention to culture.
So we have the reasons and the expression of these principles, but how do we do it? And so I mentioned the word values a moment ago. How do values show up? Are they important, Phoenix? How do you think about values with regards to culture?
Values can be a way of being able to distill the company's culture and being able to, like, if you know that one of the key culture things is, for example, is that we're caring a community, then you can then talk about, well, how do that shows up. So finding the words and having the discussion of finding those words can help people start to have it's kind of like creating self-awareness as a group around these concepts. So you could say that values are our articulated sense of our culture. So yeah, that's one of the things that we suggest companies do, is to go through a process of defining what their culture is or what they want their culture to be. And through that discussion, you really get to hear people and communicate and find where you have commonality. And that's a great culture building process.
Well put, right. And so kind of finding these principles or standards of behavior and how we orient around them and understand them together. There's like a shared process of arriving at them together collaboratively, which I think is very distinct from business as usual. I mean, values are common in business as usual companies, but I feel like a lot of business as usual companies create a list of values because they read somewhere that that's what they're supposed to do or something like that. And so they have a couple of words like innovation or, we value integrity or whatever. But the definition of those words, even if they have words around those definitions, to define those words, it wasn't co-created or developed together in a collaborative way. And that's one thing that we find really important, is that just the creation of values, sharing, dialogue, and deliberation to arrive at what are we talking about when we have a word like humility or honesty or integrity or some kind of opportunity to set up a standard. And the words can be this distillation, like you said, Phoenix. I think that's great, of culture in a set of values that could be, a short enough list that could be memorized, something that could be memorized and repeated as a language within the organization. We can celebrate people for expressing that value in terms of the behaviors to reinforce, like, hey, this is something that we want to aspire towards together. So values can become a language and important. But when we talk about it at Lyft, when we work with these organizations, we don't just co-create a list of words, three or so values for the organization. One additional things, we definitely advocate for having this shared definition and kind of an operational definition. And then beyond that, we invite organizations to create a list of habits, behaviors, and norms that they see within their organization or want to aspire to within their organization that are expressions of those values. Mm. And that list, we have templates and so forth that we, have links through the book and through our facilitated learning experience, where those lists become things that can be reviewed from time to time They could be celebrated. They could become part of performance enhancement processes. It's just that this becomes like the living, breathing one way for us to track how are we doing on our culture is like, okay, these habits, behaviors, and norms that we're kind of agreeing to, we're opting into, saying we want to live into these together. What would that be like? And so that list needs to be alive. It can get stale if you make it 5 years ago. So there needs to be some process to review them and make sure that they're alive and really reflecting what the aspirations of the people in the company are. But that's an investment of time, right? You got to come up with a list of values together and then define them together and then create some habits, behaviors, and norms and keep that process alive and then invest in that process. All of that takes time and I guess financial resources, you could say. And that's one of the reasons why we find so many organizations just ignoring or advocates, like saying, we're not going to take that time to invest in that. And we've already discussed that can come at great cost in the long run. Is there anything more you want to say about values and how we arrive at them, Athena?
I want to talk about your experiences with helping companies come to aligned sense. Has there been values that surprised you or felt particularly unique to the culture?
Definitely. I think the things that come to mind for me is that the process of co-creating values in groups or small groups and then coming together to larger groups is practicing some type of shared governance, because all the things that happen in regular day-to-day decision making, if you want to delegate authority through like a co-op or a collective organization, they show up in the values exercise as well. Meaning somebody might put a word out there like, I value integrity, and they might be really attached to that value and want to have that value be the one that the company adopts as one of its, top 3 values. Whereas the rest of the group might say, well, there's part of what you say when I hear you say integrity and when you're defining it as maybe somebody's defining, instead of wholeness, they're defining integrity as doing what you said you would do, something like that. And so then somebody says, well, to me, that really is more like authenticity or honesty. And, so then there's this almost this semantic battle or turf war about like whose word is right, integrity or authenticity. And so there's a few processes that we advocate for both in the book and in the facilitated learning experience to help groups move beyond their attachments to come to consent or consensus, depending on your decision-making process, which we'll talk about in another session here, to arrive at something that's workable. But that process of arriving at something that's workable for everybody is, for me, a microcosm of what all delegated decision-making is like in the rest of the organization. And so it's like a training ground. So arriving at shared values can be critical learning for the organization about how to get to a point where we can easily make collective decisions together, because we're not very well practiced at that. But some of the surprising values that have shown up, some ones that I like, for example, is I've seen an organization start with a value of flexibility, this idea of giving space for people to arrive to the organization and participate in the organization according to their needs, and just honoring that people are coming with different needs and coming with different capacities, and we're going to value flexibility. And that can work for a period of time, and then they might have to actually change after they've achieved a certain level of commitments to their community and their goods and services. And it's like, okay, the flexibility is no longer working for us, so we are actually changing our value to service or commitment or something like that. And so I think that's what always grabs my attention, is watching the values of an organization shift and change over time. And to me, that's a really healthy signal. It's like if we're just ignoring the values and be like, yeah, okay, our values are good, yeah, we don't need to talk about it. To me, that's like red flag or yellow flag. Like, oh no, I need to pay attention here, because if they're not really engaging with some tension, like you mentioned earlier, there has to be a diversity of perspectives. If there's not a diversity of perspectives on what the value should be or what the habits and behaviors and norms we want to aspire to, then I don't know that we're actually, well, we probably are missing out. A, and then B, the team, I find there's a lot of risk when you don't actually have some, you use the word cognitive abrasion, when there's like this like push against something, when there's a diversity of perspectives in the room, in the process. If that's not there, then I really start to worry about an organization's long-term potential.
Yeah. And then you have to realize that even though some people say, well, this is not important and it might get us into some kind of conflict or tension. But the thing is that what you want to do is unearth these things before they become problems later. Like, God forbid that someone should be so different from the rest of the team that they feel like this is not the right fit. I mean, that's very uncomfortable, but it's so much better to find that earlier in the process than later. Sometimes going back to the vision and the values, sometimes people assume that they have a lot more in common than they do. And that ends up being really painful later. It's much better to be able to catch those things early, address them. That can sometimes be the uncomfortable benefit of these processes.
Well put. Well put. So talking about uncomfortable and processes, some of the things that come up. So in the book, and of course in our training, we go through a lot of organizations and examples, case stories about how values and their expressions kind of show up in the company. But one of the places that a lot of questions come up and we spend a lot of time is around this concept of compensation. So Phoenix, when you think of culture and values and team and this whole area of compensation, what are some of the things that come to mind for you that you might want to share with listeners about how we think about it in the Next Economy MBA, this idea of compensation?
We have a wonderful breakout that I love that we developed for this, either this or the second one, where we have people who are in the company, who's the founders, and then people came in later. And we talk about how do you divide compensation? Because there's the founders who, without that, the company will never have existed. And then you have the people who have dedicated so much energy and might have done something spectacular that took the organization to another level. And money is so sticky in this culture. And so to be able to talk about your values and how you want to do it. And then what's great about having a Next Economy enterprise is that you get to start from scratch. And the benefit of that is that you have a lot of confusion because there's many different options. Like, we want to say that everyone and everything they do is equal, for example? And so we all are going to split the profit completely. But one of the things to realize is that no matter how much you want to try to create an environment and a perspective that is radically inclusive, you're still going to be impacted by the society. Like, what do you do when some of the people who work know that they could be making 10 times more if they left the company, or 3 times more, and some other people know that if they left the company they would be making half more, and how that impacts how people feel about their compensation. So it can be complex, but I think one of the reasons people are excited about doing worker-owned co-ops, for example, or any of the different new ways of working, is so that they can leave behind some of the practices that take advantage of people and don't respect people's unique gifts.
I love that, Phoenix. Some of the things that we explore with organizations and help coach them through when we work with them with regards to compensation is this idea that the needs, which are almost not considered in the business as usual economy, the needs of each of the individuals in the organization might be different. And the transparency of actually having each of the individuals involved be able to express what their needs are requires a very trusting environment, a space where somebody can be vulnerable enough to share, like, I need to take care of my elders, or I have children or dependents in some way, or I'm at this juncture in my life where I'm in transition, or whatever the case may be. There's needs, And being able to express those needs is an extraordinarily vulnerable position, especially in business as usual environments. But in our experience, to come to true pay equity or compensation equity, this idea of sharing needs and creating a shared dilemma where it's like, oh, let's solve this together. We're in this together to provide for our community some needed goods or services, and there's some transactions or reciprocity. So there's some income coming into the organization, and we want to make sure that we're still interfacing with the business as usual economy. So people kind of who are working in these organizations need to oftentimes have some cash compensation to pay for rent or food or these types of things. But one of the things that we focus on is to make sure when we think of compensation to think of what we call total compensation, all the different aspects that could be beneficial to meeting the individual's needs. So what I mean total compensation is like, in some cases, what some people are really looking for is job flexibility, so that they can have time when they need it to meet their needs, take care of an elder or something like that. But that doesn't necessarily mean they need more total cash. Maybe there's a trade-off of like, I can actually care for my dependents, or I need a lot more cash so I can pay for somebody to do it. Either one is fine, but knowing that there could be the option to have one or the other is something that the business as usual environment doesn't really invite. It doesn't really ask you like, what are your needs? That's not common in the business as usual environment. They usually say, here's the job, here's the compensation package that we associate with this job, and you're either a fit or you're not. And when we talk about compensation with next economy principles, it's developing a way to have enough transparency and vulnerability, a space where there's enough trust to be able to explore what are our needs, and then to acknowledge that our needs change over time. So one of the other things that we see common in next economy organizations is that compensation, business as usual might say, here's a job description, here's the compensation package, and maybe there's some incremental raises over time based on some formula, but that's it. It's kind of like fixed. In a next economy organization, it's like the compensation might go up, might go down, might change in character, and it's dynamic because the needs of us as humans, we're dynamic and our lives are dynamic. And so this idea of compensation needs to be alive or like a conversation. And that can be tricky with compliance and tracking, and that creates its own set of things to think about. But that adaptability and creativity are, in our experience, really required to get to something where a total compensation package actually works for the individuals in the organization. And in some cases, it can result in, for the total cost of the organization, it can actually be less than if you focused on just trying to provide market rate cash compensation and competing with the business as usual in some cases. So some of the ways I wanted to mention that we see organizations doing that we go into greater depth through case studies in the book and also in the training, are having a couple different ways in which people, their approaches to compensation. The one that we champion the most is what's called self-set salaries. And there's different ways to do it. Compensation committee, or there's the business case process or the advice process. There's a consequence to self-set salary, something that we'll talk about at another one of these MBA series recordings, but it's called open book management. The idea that if you're going to have an organization where you're inviting in the participants, the worker owners, the workers, the labor, to say, this is what I want my salary to be, this is the compensation that I want, there's kind of the prerequisite that they need to know, is this going to work for the organization, right? That sets up the need for having transparency internally about what are our costs, what are our anticipated costs, what are our revenues and other transactions, reciprocity coming into the organization, what do we expect them to be? And that requires some literacy and understanding of information about the organization, so that the consequence of saying, I want this to be my salary, for somebody to be able to know that that's going to be workable or not. But then it enrolls everybody in the organization into this shared dilemma. Open book management and open salaries and self-set salaries is not for every organization. So I want to clarify for anybody who's listening to this and being like, I have no idea how I would do this in my organization. I don't know where we're starting from. We champion it because we think it's one of the better expressions of a number of the next economy principles. But there are other ways to lean into transparency, like having a formula with merit-based adjustments, things that people can opt into and opt out of. And we have some examples of that, all oriented around this idea of compensation equity or pay equity. Phoenix, is there anything else that you want to add that we typically talk about with regards to compensation or things that I left out?
Can have a lot of really fun conversations.
We've seen a lot, haven't we?
I'd say one other thing I'd say is that when you have an organization where you have the flexibility to look at these things in a new way, one of the things that worker-owned co-ops are known for is that they can survive difficult economic periods because people are willing to say, hey, I get so much meaning out of this work. I really love my coworkers. They can all come together and decide to take less pay, or some of them take less pay who can afford to, and then survive difficult times to continue. So that's something that a lot of people don't have enough trust or a commitment to a business as usual company to even consider. But yeah, so I'm going to talk about that.
Thank you. Okay, and so a couple other topics that come to mind when we talk about culture and team in kind of an introductory sense, and I'll list them off and we can talk about them kind of one at a time. But there's kind of recruiting and both the strategy of how do we grow a team. Then there's okay, so now we're trying to grow a team. And we're recruiting. How do we do the things like interviewing and selection, where we're paying attention to bias and domination culture paradigms? And then let's say we actually hire somebody, how do we do orientation and bring them on? What are the practices there? And then finally, in this introductory culture session in the Next Economy MBA, we talk about once you have a team that's recruited, the interviewing selection has happened, you've oriented them, they're onboarded. How do you do processes for kind of performance enhancement? And the word that's unspoken there is how do you do accountability, which is a very big topic, which we'll talk about throughout this MBA series, because it becomes very important in these very warm, familial, trusting growth and development environments. Is accountability becomes very big. But maybe starting back at the top, like recruiting, Phoenix, is there anything that you want to point out as some of the high points that we talk about with regards to recruiting?
Well, knowing your culture is going to be supportive, and having a process like with recruiting, the job role descriptions, and are you going to have a committee being able to review like some of the things that support diversity? For example, we know that typically if you put in a lot of requirements, make sure that you have only the requirements you really need. Because, for example, if you want to attract women identified applicants, they're more likely to say, oh, I can't do this. Whereas people socialize as men usually are like, oh, I have 4 out of 10 of these. I'll give it a try. Yeah, so those are things to think about. One of the things is that, if you want to try to avoid having unconscious bias, making unconscious bias less of an issue, it's like sometimes doing it by committee. When you have a group of people making the decision, even though it takes longer, there's been some studies by Google and other about diversity that supports implicit bias. And I realize some of these things are not going to be possible for every organization. And then with performance, I didn't talk about orientation. I think it's having an orientation process, period. It's very important. Some companies, it's like, oh, we help them get their computer set up. And that's, but it's like, how are you going to onboard someone, how the culture works, or how to feel more at home in the community? Because how someone is introduced to the company has an impact on their sense of belonging, and then their sense of being able to contribute, and how long it takes them to become a full contributing member. And then let me see, if I have performance enhancement, so important to have that. And some companies, that's where they might, like some companies where you lose it because sometimes work is so busy. But that's an easy way to avoid problems long term, is if you have something that's catching what isn't working here before it becomes a problem. So people are getting feedback on their work. It's horrible when some companies, they're not great at being able to tell people authentically what's going on. And so having a formal process where people are getting feedback kind of can force the issue and, again, avoid issues that could become so much more intense later on. And also, it's not just about problems, but it's accentuating the positive. When people I've gone to some performance reviews like, oh yeah, there was that mistake I did, and then I'm getting all this positive reinforcement for the things that I've done well. And creates more enthusiasm and more of a commitment to the organization. It's a way to maximize the positive. So a lot of things that can be done with the performance enhancement. And what about you, Kevin? When you think about compensation, recruiting, interviewing, orientation, and performance, what comes to mind?
Yeah, definitely, obviously, many of the same things that you mentioned. Some of the things I would add on recruiting, kind of, you mentioned that addressing implicit bias at every step of the process. So one thing that we've seen be helpful over time is that really soliciting a sufficiently large candidate pool, building out connector networks. This is where some of the values of the organization might show up. And we talk about in the principles of next coming organizations, both diverse and inclusive ownership and democratic governance process. And so actually having diversity of perspectives is really critical for an organization. In order to embrace that, depending on where you're starting at as an organization, you may need to develop rapport and connectors to have a candidate pool, having a large candidate pool to be able to have. Sometimes when people complain to us oh, we're not getting the diversity of applicants that we want, we ask about what's your process of growing your candidate pool? How did you go about that? And that's where we often find opportunities for growth and development. You mentioned the role description. We'll talk about this later in the MBA series, but we take, in some cases, a very granular approach of actually defining the actual tasks that are needed in the organization to develop from the bottom up a role description. But then, like Phoenix said, making sure that in the way the role description is presented to prospective candidates is to really focus on the must-haves, the things that are really critical for the role to succeed, and making sure to disambiguate or distinguish between preferences and traditions versus the requirements. What does the role actually require? And that those distinctions can be very healthy for the organization to continue to check in on, to really make sure that you're not excluding people through conforming with some of the societal norms about who may or may not apply based on how the role description is written. So actually having a really great role description is, I think, critical when it comes to interviewing. I think the theme that we really make sure people are set up to succeed in the interview. Interviewing can be another place where bias shows up in our experience very strongly. And so Phoenix mentioned committees, I think is powerful. Sometimes with interviews, maybe there's different methods, right? So when we conduct interviews and coach organizations, we suggest that they send the questions that they're going to ask to the candidates ahead of time, giving time to prepare. As an example, there's a certain accommodations that we think are really healthy. We also advocate for, where possible, working interviews so that you can actually work with the candidate for some period of time before selection is complete. And those would be compensated working interviews. Obviously, this is another place to check in on values alignment and vision alignment, which we think are really critical to selection for hiring. And again, like Phoenix said, depending on your industry and how fast you need to hire and different things, not every principle or practice is going to show up the same way for every organization with regards to interviewing and selecting. But then the onboarding process, have one. I love that observation. I think onboarding is really critical. Other things that I would say that we think are really important is to do your best to really block out the time, giving time for reflection and feedback, and making sure that your values are embedded in your onboarding process. And so we'll put a lot of attention in planning an onboarding process and advocate that organizations really script out the first 30, 60, 90 days of working together in some gross amount of detail, such that it's a really critical time for getting that opt-in and making sure that the community agreements or the team agreements are opted into, and really practicing all the cultural investments and the values, the habits, behaviors, and norms that you associate with the values, bringing that language into the onboarding process. And then in terms of performance enhancement, I think even the way we say enhancement rather than performance reviews, for us, we'll talk a lot more about accountability throughout this MBA series. It becomes really important. But for some of our observations are that if you mentioned things like the positive feedback and encouragement, how critical that can be to the culture of an organization or an individual's growth and development. And the way we've tried to structure all our templates around performance enhancement and all of our coaching and consulting practice around performance enhancement is to really build a culture of self-evaluation rather than externalized judgment. So encouraging building the muscle of like, these are the areas where I see the opportunity for me to improve. These are the areas where I think I'm thriving, and and then acknowledging and celebrating both of those observations. And where there's an enhancement opportunity in the review process or the evaluation process, the enhancement process, if there are tasks that are not being performed adequately to the standards that the organization believes for the role description, then to meet those as opportunities and meet those with support rather than recrimination, judgment. And so instead of immediately having consequences, it starts with, what support do you need? Let's create a support plan to address these opportunities. We'll talk about this later with different accountability systems, but so it's support first, then it could be formal training and development, and then at some point there doesn't need to be consequences. So when I say support in this loving and familial, warm environment, it doesn't mean that I'm not trying to say that there's no consequences to quote unquote inadequate performance. It means that we start with the idea that the presumption that support will be effective, and we start with that presumption and see how far you can get. And in our experience, by doing that, just changing the tone of performance enhancement, it's something that people can look forward to in an organization. Like, I love my performance enhancement, evaluation process, because this is an opportunity for me to grow as a human and learn about myself, become more self-aware, become more reflective, and to actually get more comfortable with asking for and receiving support for my own development as a human, and what a gift that could be.
Yep, I love what you're saying. And of course, we know how hard this is to do on the day-to-day level.
Definitely takes practice. In the Next Economy MBA training, you'll hear case stories from organizations that we've had the privilege of working with, or those that we know as partners. And in the book, there's also case studies and just more detail on how to go about some of these things and develop those practices. Phoenix and I have had the opportunity here today just to cover some of the high points about culture and team and values and how they can show up in next economy organizations. And hopefully you've learned why we think they're important, and hopefully got some inspiration about areas that might have been new to you. Any last words before we sign off for this one?
Just how much trying to do anything new is so important. We need new models, and so we encourage you in your efforts, whether it's changing your existing organization or starting a new one.
Wonderful. Thanks, listeners, and we look forward to having you join for the next one.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's lifteconomy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.